I just want to begin by thanking the organizers of the conference for such a stimulating few days, and the fellow speakers, and the audience for sticking with us. And also a disclaimer, I've come down with a cold, so I might be a bit croaky, but I hope I can get through this. Okay. In 1943, Alberto Burri was captured by Allied forces while serving as a military doctor in the Italian army in Tunisia during the Second World War. From there, he was sent as a prisoner of war to an internment camp in Hereford, Texas. It was here that he began to make collages and drawings, before abandoning medicine to become a full-time artist when he returned to Rome after the war in 1946. In 1949, Burri began to make his sacchi, or sacks, using the Hessian containers of Marshall aid supplies being sent to Italy by the Red Cross as part of the effort to rebuild the country. The first of these was SZ1, which you see here behind me, which featured an American flag smeared in red paint as an ambiguous testament to the country's influence on a war-torn Europe, and which emphasized the sack's original function for sending aid to Italy under the auspices of the Marshall Plan. Burri's sackcloths bear witness not only to the poverty of post-war Italy, but through their stitched and worn surfaces also imply a Franciscan sackcloth aesthetic. This recalls Burri's upbringing in a small Umbrian village near Assisi, where the patched robe of St. Francis is still on display. Referencing both a reliquary and the bandaging of wounds he experienced as a doctor during the Second World War, Burri's work in this context simultaneously conjured an Italy both past and viscerally present, and in some ways set the agenda for the post-war emulation of the idea of poverty in Italy as a way to define itself, and which stretched all the way back to its patron saint, St. Francis, as emblematized by his impoverished sackcloth cowl. The critic Germano Cilant has gone so far as to argue that it was through Burri's practice that Italy's recent fascist past and the trauma of the Second World War could be addressed, exercised, and repaired. Cilant's reading of Burri and the way in which his strategies foregrounded those of arte povera suggests the cathartic dimension of post-war Italian art in a manner not too dissimilar to contemporaneous German artists such as Joseph Beuys. Italian critics of Burri's work in the 1950s and 1960s tended to emphasize the sense of povertà, or poverty, conveyed by Burri's tattered rags and remnants. In the catalogue essay for Burri's one-man exhibition at the Galleria Malbra in Rome in December 1962, Cesare Brande underscored the, quote, poor material of Burri's sacchi, in one of the first references to poverty in either the intellectual or material sense that decade in connection to the visual arts, which would culminate in the emergence of arte povera as the dominant tendency in Italian art, one that was heavily indebted to Burri. Maurizio Calvesi's 1971 monograph on Burri went further. It argued how, quote, the image of Italy embodied in Burri's sacks and plastics is not the neo-industrial Italy of Fontana or the nostalgic Italy of Melotti. It is, in its own way, a political Italy. His Italy is a solitary, angry nation, conquered, reduced to the status of a colony, relegated to the third world, end quote. Today, I would like to examine the post-war period in Italy, and especially the development of arte povera, in terms of the surprising and somewhat problematic way in which some artists and critics characterize Italy as increasingly a colony of America, and identified with other territories in order to formulate a strategy of refusal. Of course, the post-war period was the time when this tripartite division of the world into first, second, and third was first codified. Charity Scribner provides a pithy summary of this in her book Requiem for Communism. And as she argues, quote, the term First World, like its counterparts, Second World and Third World, is a product of the Cold War. In the early 50s, when the European and North American superpowers sought to extend their spheres of influence, demographer Alfred Sauvy introduced the notion of three worlds. In an article in L'Observateur, he designated the contested, non-industrialized regions of the global south as a tiers monde, or third world. From Soviet's expression were extrapolated the first world of the United States and its capitalist allies, and the second world of the Soviet Union and its satellites. This schema became prevalent at the Bandung Conference in 1955. In 1959, the journal Tiers Monde was established. Soon thereafter, these expressions passed into general usage, end quote. While this outline would seemingly place Italy firmly in the first world, what is striking is how many Italian artists and critics sought to define the country's post-war condition, from the devastation experienced after the end of fascism to the transformation effected by the rapid industrialization of the Miracolo Italiano, or economic miracle, as one of poverty and in opposition to advanced capitalist countries such as America, in order to preserve a sense of Italy's own unique identity and position. The influence of Buri's sackcloths on arte povera, which bore testimony to an Italy emerging from the ashes of the Second World War, is therefore clear. Following on from Buri's sacchi, arte povera sought a poverty and simplicity that was diametrically opposed to the commodity-driven iconography of pop art. It is also important to remember that the development of post-war Italian art and arte povera was set against an incredibly tumultuous political context. This included the deprivation endured in the wake of the Second World War and the dislocation engendered by the rapid mass urbanization and industrialization of the Marshall Plan-sponsored Miracolo Italiano, a remarkable period of exponential economic growth that profoundly transformed Italy from an essentially agrarian country into an industrial one in just 5 short years, between 1958 and 1963. This sought to update and reinvent Italy according to American lines and decimated the country's agrarian character, as lamented by Pier Paolo Pasolini, a figure to whom we will later return. Together with American aid, the growth of companies such as Fiat, which by 1967 was selling more cars in Europe than any other country, and other firms such as Olivetti and Zanussi contributed to Italy's burgeoning foreign trade. Yet this miracle caused Italy a great deal of social tension, upheaval, and a seeming identity crisis. A case in point was the mass migration from the poor south to the rich north. This diaspora was documented by Luchino Visconti's film Rocco and His Brothers of 1960, which juxtaposed the harsh reality of the North's newfound prosperity against the South's pool of cheap labor, and highlighted the fact that Italy's wages during the 1950s were the lowest in Europe. Visconti's modern fable was a testament both to the dramatic transformation that Italy experienced during this time and the struggle for some of its populace to keep pace with this change. Cellant's manifesto, Arte Povera Notes for a Guerrilla War, which launched the group upon its publication in 1967, proclaimed its radical dimension, invoking revolutionary rhetoric as an attack on consumerism. Cellant's founding text, coinciding with the death of Che Guevara in October 1967, which provoked a fresh wave of anti-American demonstrations against the Vietnam War across Italy, thrust arte povera into an Italian art scene still struggling to cope with the increasing domination of American artists, as exemplified by Robert Rauschenberg's controversial win of the Grand Prize at the Venice Biennale in 1964. Notably, Cellant's metaphorical guerrilla war was also appropriated by the dissenting students, Italian students of 1968, who identified themselves with neo-Marxist political heroes such as Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh, Che Guevara, and espoused the guerrilla tactics of the Vietnamese General Giap, predicting that, quote, the university will be our Vietnam. As Paul Ginsberg observed in his History of Post-War Italy, quote, the Vietnam War changed the way a whole generation of Italians thought about America. The American dream of the 1950s was shattered by the newsreels of the napalming of Vietnamese villages in the 1960s and by the example of peasant resistance to the American war machine, end quote. Anger over the American invasion of Vietnam reached a crescendo with nationwide protests across Italy on December 21st, 1965. These demonstrations were reflected quite literally in Michelangelo Pistoletto's mirror painting Vietnam from that same year, which showed one of the political protests against the situation and drew the viewer involuntarily into the crowd, defying us to remain passive viewers, as you see from this rather startled man in the photo here. This work was also provocatively shown at Pistoletto's solo exhibition at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis in 1966. From 1966 to 1967, the Cultural Revolution in China inspired a wave of Maoist fervor in Italy, which added to the references to struggles in other territories being appropriated. The spectre of Chinese communism would also be evoked in right-wing reactions to the student protests of 1968 in Italy. The newspaper Corriere della Sera referred to the students as Cinesi, a phrase that, as Robert Lumley argues, quote, conjured up the red menace and the yellow peril in one. Chalant's claims of arte povera as an art of guerrilla warfare that rejected consumer society positioned it as a riposte to the advanced capitalist and industrial aesthetic of, respectively, American pop art and minimalism, and aligned itself instead with the struggles in Vietnam, Latin America, and the Cultural Revolution in China. The language of guerrilla warfare echoed through Chalant's text, ricocheted through the universities, and was inscribed upon Mario Mertz's Igloo de Giap, or Giap's Igloo, of 1968. Here, Mertz scrawled a statement on guerrilla tactics, wrongly ascribed to the Viet Cong general, as it turns out, in neon across a structure covered in sandbags, imbuing it with revolutionary intent. And the inscription reads, "If the enemy concentrates, he loses ground. If he scatters, he loses force." Similarly, Mertz's Igloo, Gaddafi's tent, begun the same year in 1968, made reference to the Libyan general the year before the coup d'etat in 1969. This military aesthetic of arte povera is also seen in Pino Pasquale's bricolage works Le Armi, or Weaponry, of 1965, constructed from consumer detritus. Here, water pipes, light meters, tires, camping equipment, and even a Fiat carburetor were reconfigured into full-scale facsimiles of cannons, missile launchers, and machine guns. This nexus between the simultaneously aggressive and defensive aesthetic of Mertz's work, Chalant's rhetoric, and Giap's supposed strategy is suggestive of how, in the late 1960s in Italy, invoking the ideology of guerrilla warfare acted not only as a reference to and condemnation of US troops in Vietnam, but was also deployed as a charged metaphor for the struggles against perceived American imperialism. If America's military interventions in Vietnam and economic and cultural involvement in Italy were aimed at halting the spread of communism in both countries, then this unlikely solidarity was used in Italy to resist American cultural and economic influence. As Massimo Teodori writes in his book Maledetti Americani, or Cursed Americans, quote, "During the 1960s, a new wave of anti-Americanism went through Italian politics and society, fostered by the protest movements which originated in the US itself. Both the traditional communists and different credos, Marxist-Leninist, Maoist, Trotskyist, Third Worldist, took the variegated world of that protest, the student revolts, the campaigns for civil rights and against poverty, and the opposition to the war in Vietnam, for something similar to a revolutionary moment of a Marxist and communist left," end quote. Therefore, the language of turf warfare and contested ground, as ascribed to General Giap, quoted by Mertz, appropriated by Chalant, and claimed by the students of 1968, marks an uneasy alignment where guerrilla war served as an analogue for cultural rivalry, peasant resistance as a model for arte povera's renunciation of consumerism, and Vietnam as a metaphor for university protests. Chalant's framing of arte povera chimed with a youth movement in Italy that, as Paul Ginsberg has argued, accepted a, quote, dangerously casual attitude towards violence, adopting contemporary South American and Asian liberation struggles as their models, with little reflection on their applicability or likely consequence in the Italian situation, end quote. Chalant's appropriation of the model of Asian and Latin American urban guerrilla movements for his manifesto was a similar position to the one that would ultimately be taken up by Red Terrorism, with a 2-volume study of the Tupamaros published by Feltrinelli in 1971 becoming a, quote, sort of do-it-yourself manual for the early Red Brigades. That's Paul Ginsberg again. Contemporaneous with Chalant's Notes for a Guerrilla War was Umberto Eco's essay Towards a Semiological Guerrilla Warfare, given as a conference paper in 1967 and published the following year. Like Chalant, Eco also explored the revolutionary potential of a new Italian society polarized by its geographical and economic schism. As Eco argued, quote, "For a Milanese bank clerk, a TV ad for a refrigerator represents a stimulus to buy. But for an unemployed peasant in Calabria, the same image means the confirmation of a world of prosperity that doesn't belong to him and that he must conquer. That is why I believe TV advertising in depressed countries functions as a revolutionary message." End quote. Within this divisive context, pop art and minimalism tended to be viewed in Italy as yet another exported product from a technological and industrialized country. As Benjamin Bucklow has pointed out, quote, "To the very extent that the Italian misreading of American minimalist sculpture emphasized technology as its primary mode of production, Arte Povera took up an explicitly anti-technological stance," end quote. In an infamous 1966 interview, Donald Judd stated, "I'm totally uninterested in European art and I think it's over with." Elsewhere in this interview, Judd spoke of, quote, "the structures, values, feelings of the whole European tradition. It suits me fine if that's all down the drain." Judd's reviews for Arts magazine went even further, often contrasting European art unfavorably with its American counterpart. An example being his damning of Yves Klein with faint praise as, quote, "the biggest frog in a rather stagnant pond." Chalant was one person from Judd's stagnant pond to react to what he described as an obtuse and absurd dismissal. Judd's critique, published 1 year prior to the codification of Arte Povera, provided the impetus for Chalant to model his forces. In his words, Arte Povera aimed to contaminate the pristine condition of minimalism and to, quote, "call the American media into question." Arte Povera was therefore a legitimate defense of an historic culture run on the rocks, as European culture was. The only hope for salvation lay in rejecting Puritanism and homogenization, in contaminating them and ripping them open with soft and acid matter, with animals and fire, with primitive craft techniques like axe blows, with rags and earth, stones and chemicals. The important thing was to corrode, cut open and fragment, to decompose the imposed cultural regime. Pino Pasquale's 1 and 2 cubic meters of earth of 1967 seemed to heed Chalant's battle cry, referencing and arguably ridiculing Judd's sculptures by parodying the minimalist cube and translating its primary structures into the primary materials of Arte Povera. In 1968, the critic Filiberto Menna stated that artists associated with Arte Povera, including Pasquale, Michelangelo Pistoletto, and Yannis Kounelis, were seeking to, quote, "open new directions elsewhere, towards nature, the artisanal and organic." This position is exemplified in Pasquale's series of works called Reconstruction of Nature from 1968. The same year as Menna's comment, and the tension between nature and artifice as evinced by Pasquale's farm tools from 1968, which you see here, or his artfully artificial plowed field from 1967. These works attest to the agrarian impulse of Arte Povera, which coincided with Pier Paolo Pasolini's laments in his writings on the rapid industrialization and urbanization of Italy during the 1950s and 60s, the subsequent loss of peasant traditions, and a call for Italy to return to its agrarian past. Pasquale's plowed fields, with their strangulated parodies of furrows of earth, also overlap with the standoff between nature and industry, encapsulated by Yannis Kounelis' iron containers of soil and cacti, ordering their contents into strangely regimented rows, as in this untitled work from 1967. Beyond his writings, which tended to focus on the increasingly schizophrenic nature of Italian society, I would also like to briefly mention the documentaries of Pasolini of the late 1960s, such as Notes for a Film on India of 1968, which considered the poverty of post-independence Italy, and the challenge the country faced in modernizing without becoming westernized, or Notes for an African Arrestees of 1970, where a group of African students at the University of Rome criticized Pasolini's misapprehensions about the continent, and which has recently been analyzed in depth by Giovanna Trento's study, Pasolini in Africa. If, for Pasolini, the time he spent in Uganda and Tanzania while filming Medea in 1969 bizarrely reminded him of the now lost culture of Rome's slums, as he commented rather awkwardly, quote, "Archaic civilization, superficially called folklore, must not be forgotten, despised, and betrayed, but it must be integrated within this new civilization." And it's worth saying here that this film was actually never made because it was so problematic. I think it encapsulates much of what we're discussing today. Finally, if I began with one flag, Buri's implication of the US banner in his sacks, I would like to end with another. Alighiero Boetti's series of maps, produced by weavers in Afghanistan and Pakistan from 1971 until his death in 1994, may be some of the most important and open-ended geopolitical works associated with arte povera, and refute the rigid boundaries of nationhood subscribed to by earlier artists such as Buri, in both their facture and form. These began with Boetti's political map of the world of 1969, which you see here, made from a map where each nation's flag was delineated by hand, and the territorial borders of each country are shown by the flag. In 1971, after his first trip to Afghanistan that previous year, Boetti began to have his maps embroidered by local weavers there using traditional skills. Boetti's complete cycle of maps, created over a 20-year period, gradually reveals such changes as the decline of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Through the shifting colors and emblems that metonomically evoke each country and the political system that governs it. By outsourcing his methods of production and employing weavers from Afghanistan and Pakistan to create his works, Boetti pointed towards both increasing geopolitical complexities and the ever-expanding globalization of the art world. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for the organizers for organizing this wonderful and almost dream-like conference. I've been having a very nice time. Okay. So today, I will be speaking about post-war social practice in art in relation to Zero on Sea, the world's pioneering international site-specific art project intended to offer direct social engagement, scheduled to open in September 1965 at Scheveningen Pier, the Netherlands. So in the end, this didn't happen, but it would have been the most exciting destination for such artist collectives as the Japanese Gutai, the German Zero, the Dutch Null, and the New York-based Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama. Despite geographic distances, they defied existing categories of art, that's very important, and brought their singular works to the street. This chapter of post-war art in Japan has been interpreted as vernacular modernism, and in Europe, centering mostly on Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. But for many artists and intellectuals who witnessed the devastating effect of absolutism during the war, the existential issue at stake was also how one can decide without necessarily conforming to social demands. So it's not only about freedom, but how can we be free, what is going to become very important for these people. Stimulating creative faculties in the spectators through participation thus became important. Philosophical parallels to this can be found in the writings of, for example, Umemoto Katsumi's Shutai Seiron or Emmanuel Levinas's new ontology. And these are the places I'm going to cover in this talk, so it's going to be a little challenging. And I'll be using Kusama as a case study and drawing examples from the works by prospective painters, participants of Zero on Sea, so prospective participants of Zero on Sea. I will compare the artistic developments in Japan, the United States, and Europe, and discuss post-war social engagement in art in relation to subjective autonomy. Its ultimate goal was change. My talk will be in three parts. First, I will investigate post-war subjective autonomy and discuss how it also liberated art from medium specificity. Second, I will explore social dimension of the monochrome painting. Third, I will discuss how Kusama challenged governing principle of modernity with her psychedelic art, a plan she submitted to Zero on Sea. Born in Matsumoto in central Japan in 1929, Kusama grew up during World War II, the time when, quote, imperialism and militarism melded together, which deprived individuals of their ability to develop free thinking, unquote, as she remembered it. Kusama was initially trained in Nihonga, which is Japanese-style painting, the painting practice most frequently associated with Japan's national art from the late 1880s through 1945. Notwithstanding the vehement nationalism that underscored Nihonga, what attracted to Kusama was its main principle, jiko hattatsu. The Japanese word jiko in English is self, and hattatsu is development. According to the art historian Kawakita Michiaki, what Nihonga genuinely encouraged at its inception during Meiji period was the concept of self-development. As the wartime propaganda in various material form permeated the national mindset, making reality increasingly remote, Kusama tried to confirm her own existence and become her own person. Nihonga aspect of self-development became especially important for her. And this is the map which explains, and it's from the National Archives, how the United States psychologically controlled all these occupied territories. So the globe was becoming very much like, close together. So after the war, the US-led occupation brought further confusion by denying all patriotic values encouraged by the military government, enforcing a US model of democracy and capitalism. In visual art, this was the time when surrealism gained renewed interest. Kusama discovered the movement through a local surrealist and held a successful second solo exhibition at the Matsumoto City Civic Hall in 1952. The show put her on the map of Japan's vanguard scene. In these artworks, she explored the depth of her psyche in order to free herself from social constraints. Overseas, the two prospective Zero on Sea participants, the Dutch artist Armando and the German Günther Uecker, also created strikingly psychological work exploring their shattered memories of the war. With his informal painting, Armando attempted to access traumatic memories of growing up in the vicinity of the Jewish transit camp in the Netherlands by repeatedly scarring the surface of his large dog painting. Oh, it's turned a little dark. Okay. And then Uecker began compulsively hammering nails into supports provoked by his memory of boarding up the windows of his house as a young boy to protect against bomb blasts during the war in Germany. In Japan, and I think this looks pretty surrealistic, Kazuo Shiraga of the Gutai Art Association also tried to locate his own shishitsu, or essential quality of a person, beyond socially imposed ideas through his art that would act as a, and quote, this is his own word, guide to prevent human beings from drowning or being swept irresistibly by the current of the time, unquote, as he put it. In his Gutai Manifesto of 1956, the group's leader, Yoshihara Jiro, too made a case for human freedom through encouraging its members to place an utmost premium on daring advance into the unknown world. With this new creative freedom at the third Genbi exhibition, the Gutai artist Atsuko Tanaka introduced a bell as an art medium and invited viewers to activate 20 interconnected bells, with which she attempted to awaken each viewer into his or her own essential being. Other Gutai artists also tried to develop a sense of autonomy in public. With the 1956 outdoor Gutai art exhibition held at Asia Park, artists provoked their participants to, quote, think, create, and imagine for themselves, unquote, as Min Tianpo, I hope she's in the audience, okay, observed. Though Kusama's art did not develop beyond painting in Japan, she became increasingly aware of audience positioning after arriving in New York in June 1958. She initially struggled to adjust to the abstract expressionist large format paintings. Her breakthrough came abruptly in the spring of 1959 after Barnett Newman's first New York exhibition in 8 years, which drew the art world's full attention with its mural-sized paintings, impressing many by their stern simplicity. Before she saw Newman's work, which was virtually invisible in New York until that time, Kusama noted Mark Rothko in her notebook. Both Rothko and Newman invited viewers to come closer to experience their art without any preconceived ideas. Through this experience, Newman wished his paintings to offer the viewer, quote, the feelings of his own totality, of his own separateness, of his own individuality, unquote, which was his response to the wartime totalitarianism. A son of Jewish immigrants from Poland, Newman experienced a moral crisis during the war. He remembered, quote, when Hitler was ravaging Europe, unquote, he felt that painting was dead because it couldn't say anything. He resumed painting in 1944, began challenging cultural and societal norms from within European civilization by also exploring what he called meta, which was about beyond what is known, similar to what Gutai encouraged, leaping into unknown world. A month after Newman's show, Kusama abruptly moved to a large loft in part to accommodate the enormous size of her canvas called net painting. Her earliest net paintings were typically large, with horizontal walks painted in oil. The ground of the white net was prepared in black. Once the foundation was dry, different from Newman's work, Kusama, like Armando and Yucker, obsessively rendered small white arcs until every square inch of the canvas was filled. Obsession, according to Freud, is a trauma psychology and impulse to go back to a repressive, morbid anxiety. Still, Kusama finished her painting by applying a thin layer of white, and that is very important. And you can see how crazy she is. This is all her net paintings in the back, okay? Her earliest net paintings were, tailored to the dimension of the walls, and she really measured this wall literally. Kusama's white net paintings gave an initial impression of no-show, recalled the critic Lucy Lippard. This required people to come closer, seeing from up close. The broad, delicate surface of the net painting potentially induced attention that gave the viewer a sense of his or her own scale and existence. This, in her words, was an attempt to comprehend, quote, the national senses of human beings, unquote, which is similar to what Newman described as his own totality, also as Shiraga's pursuit of subjective autonomy. Furthermore, the viewing of Kusama's net painting at close proximity diminishes the divide between the subject, viewer, and the object, painting. This situation is similar to Emmanuel Levinas's idea of phase. A Jewish survivor of a Nazi prisoner of war camp, Levinas thought that in a face-to-face encounter, it becomes impossible for one to objectify the other, which will open up an interhuman ethical relationship. It was this intuitive ethical relationship that would serve as the basis for newly autonomous individuals to act within and upon society. And these are the floating pictures. Okay, now we are in Europe. In Europe, Udo Kultermann, who included Kusama and Rothko in his monochrome Maleret exhibition held at the State Museum of Leverkusen, Germany in 1960, explained that the monochrome painting was a new artless art that amounted to creative expression only through the onlooker's creative imagination. The autonomous creative being, according to Otto Pine, a principal member of the German Zero, can be mobilized. For Pine, the monochrome paintings composed of light reflection surface and serial structures are seen in the Vision in Motion, which is this exhibition, at Huisenhaus, Belgium, was about motion. The evening climax, and then in the following year, wanting to transform post-war society by directly engaging the public, the Zero group went outdoors by transforming their art into a form of demonstration. The first such attempt, Zero edition exposition demonstration, was held on July 5th, 1961 in Düsseldorf that celebrated the publication of Zero magazine 03, subtitled Dynamo. In this exhibition, the core members of Zero, Pine and Heinz Mack, declared their intent to construct a new visual field helped by the dynamo of public energy. And you can see that Beuys, before he became a social sculptor, was part of this initiative. Okay, and then the evening's climax was launching Pine's homemade hot air balloon, which symbolized the break with the past and daringly into the unknown, similar to the way Newman and Yoshihara conceived the new post-war art. This transformative flow of human energy embodied in the Zero demonstration not only energized such participants as Joseph Beuys and Namjoon Paik, but also inspired the Dutch Null artist Henk Peters, who made demonstration part of the first Null exhibition, which took place at the December 1961, which was called Exhibition Demonstration Zero. In the following year, he invited Kusama and Newman to the exhibition Null, among other artists, held at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. This desire for active social engagement led Peters to ultimately plan Zero on Sea together with his gallerist. Kusama's submission to Zero on Sea was her first psychedelic art, which was called Love Forever. The work further explains how she sought subjective autonomy in her participants for social change. For this work, Timothy Leary's first public lecture on consciousness expanding drag and his August 1965 demonstration of psychedelic light show were immensely influenced. With his sound and light show, an amalgam of sound, flashing light, and images reflected on the mirror walls, really offered transformative experience to the viewers. Already that fall, Kusama logged in her notebook, quote, "I'm preparing an electric sculpture," unquote. This would become her first psychedelic art. She would later introduce herself as the high priestess of her movement, echoing Leary's high priest of his pseudo-religious movement, the League of Spiritual Discovery, in short, LSD. With the cancellation of Zero and C, Kusama built a similar work to Love Forever entitled Peep Show at Castellane Gallery in New York in March 1966. This mirror-lined hexagonal room with the blue, red, white, and yellow light bulbs on the ceiling, flashing on and off several times per second, while Beatles music, that's very important, was playing for the show's duration, was meant to induce synesthetic effects, and mirrors were an important guide to the psychedelic experience. One goal of psychedelic art was to alter the spectator's normal perception. According to Leary, our surroundings make imprints on the human brain, thus reinventing the environment can produce different levels of consciousness. Different levels of consciousness, stages of imprinting information, and psychogeometry, which can modify human behavior. Through Peep Show, and though Peep Show was a very enclosed environment that people couldn't enter inside, her original idea, her Love Forever, was that people were allowed to get inside of the installation and be in there as what you were looking at. And by June 1967, Kusama developed Peep Show into her first psychedelic happening, Self-Obliteration. Adopting Leary's sound and light show, she called it an audio-visual light performance, which one of them I'm going to show you now, and Mai's is going to help us. Okay, and this is how much people's behaviors were changed. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So with her psychedelic happenings, you can hear this sound. The sounds are going to activate the dormant part of your brain, and it's going to change your behavior. And then at one point she writes love on one of the performers' back, and love was, and eros especially, was a very, very, the love and eros, maybe we can, okay, maybe a little bit later, sorry. And love, and especially eros, was very important, and in terms of New Left, and this morning we had an excellent presentation by Eva, and I feel like I'm just illustrating her lecture here. Eros, according to the main theorist of the New Left, Herbert Marcuse, was a life force, and there were a very strong connection between hippies and the New Left at the time in the United States. People were, and he thought that people were generally miserable since they were effectively manipulated and organized by, quote, dehumanizing condition of profitable affluence called capitalism, a system that values labor over pleasure. If the human body can become an instrument of pleasure, then Marcuse believed that people would be more satisfied and the world could become a better place. During the Vietnam War, many New Left supporters thus wanted to fight for eros against death. After the global uprising of the radical left in 1968, and we have to go back to, 1968, however, this human revolution, which sought for people's spiritual well-being, was quickly suppressed in the United States. This was done by the FBI monitoring, actually, many ordinary citizens in order to gain normality by the government concept, and this is my conclusive slide, okay. And within this political shift, what we got is this, okay. So today, the 60s art is very much interpreted through the gallery-based artists, and this is Leo Castelli celebrating his art gallery. In 1977, you see Castelli, Joseph Kossuth, Andy Warhol, Rauschenberg, very much what we learn in canonical art history. And this was possible because, according to the neoliberal principle, there is a scale in capitalism, and when capitalism becomes global, a single person can have a huge influence in that. So, but yet still, and this is my conclusion, we must remember that there existed movements that tried to transform the governing principle of modernity by questioning the socially imposed values and ideas through subjective autonomy realized by active social engagement in art. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for being here, and thanks for the opportunity for me to share with you my first stage of my PhD research. And I'm sorry, but you're going to hear more about Oiticica after yesterday. I hope it's going to be a little bit different, but this paper is based on my current PhD research, and therefore is an open investigation. What do I want to address here is an analysis of Piero Manzoni and Helio Oiticica's subversive practices in order to propose the formation of a novel transnational network of connection. This correspondence will be explored, arguing for the mutual achievement of what I term degree zero art. In 1964, Otto Pine defined zero as follows. From the beginning, we looked upon the term zero, not as an expression of nihilism or as a data-like gag, but as a word indicating a zone of silence and pure possibilities for a new beginning, as the countdown when rockets take off. Zero is the incommensurable zone in which the old state turns into the new. Following from Pine, I define zero as a state of pure beginning, and I qualify degree zero art as the category exploited by both artists in overcoming restrictive models of inspiration of the early works. Indeed, a degree zero attitude is what allows Oiticica to resolve the inner tension between anthropophagical act of devouring European styles and the desire for a new cultural zero ground. And degree zero is also the device adopted by Manzoni to reconcile the conflict between a survival of a lyrical symbolism and the issue of the tabula rasa. The tabula rasa is the means that makes Manzoni's distance from contemporary Italian trends possible. For both, the aim was to emancipate themselves, Oiticica from post-colonial legacies and Manzoni from traditional artistic patterns. This presentation will be divided into sections. In the first section, I will focus on Oiticica, surveying the nature of the tension claimed before, namely the progress from geometric abstraction to a participatory art. In the second section, I will concentrate on Manzoni, examining the artistic process that brought him to the formulation of degree zero aesthetic. The main core of my discussion will be Oiticica's Parangole and Manzoni acronyms. Indeed, I will explain how both artworks fulfill the notion of degree zero art and why that can be considered the turning point, the rupture in Manzoni's and Oiticica's oeuvre. Methodologically, my aesthetic analysis will consider the case of Manzoni and Oiticica separately. In doing so, I want to avoid limited visual analogies between the two. Indeed, comparing Oiticica's Serie Branca and Manzoni's acronyms might be a good starting point, but certainly not the strongest to justify the whole correspondence. Before getting to the heart of the debate, I present two more premises in order to sustain and make my thesis clearer. The first is that this notion of cultural zero is not unknown in the literature on Oiticica. Scholar Sonia Sasdein argues that the establishment of a cultural zero was necessary for Oiticica to, quote, hierarchize the dependency between dominator and dominated, end quote. Art historian Sergio Martins, recalling Sasdein's opinion, locates Oiticica's constructive will alongside the desire of a cultural zero to avoid any reliance on Europe. The second premise regards the nature of the development of Oiticica's and Manzoni's art. My claim is that the tension mentioned before cannot be conceived as proper ruptures in the artist's own practices. Indeed, as Luke Skrybowski has pointed out, progressing step by step, Oiticica's work did not resolve the challenges raised by an earlier one. This movement is dialectical in the classic sense of Aufhebung. Each concept raises from the sublation of the previous one in an almost fluid development, a cyclic modus of recurring elements. Regarding Manzoni, Flaminio Gualdoni remarks how each group of works by the artist doesn't exclude the preceding ones. Rather, they interweave with them, creating problematic intersections in a way that each series alternates from necessity. Therefore, on one hand, I will emphasize Oiticica and Manzoni's own struggles as the impetus of moving beyond restricted parameters. On the other hand, I will argue that this rupture is deceptive in respect of the whole artistic production. I want to start with two strictly similar quotes. I refuse to discuss what has been done before 1958, and there's no reason to take seriously my pre-59 production. Both quotes refers to the artist's earlier work. Manzoni is probably rejecting his nuclear period, while Oiticica is denying his abstract geometric works. From 1955 to 1959, Oiticica made different kinds of works that we have already seen yesterday, such as the Gruppo Frente paintings, the Metaschemas, and the White series. Playing with physical and metaphysical possibilities of color, the gouaches on cardboard Oiticica produced under the apprenticeship with Ivan Serpa show a clear influence of Paul lyrical abstraction. However, between 1957 and 1958, Mondrian became Oiticica's primary source of inspiration. The geometric shapes that constitute Oiticica's metaschemas are organized according to the rational principle of the grid and follow a mirror effect. With the potentiality of repetition ad infinitum, these forms are arranged conform to a rhythm. Color is a crucial matter for Oiticica in this phase, but not the only one. Being always associated with time and structure and scrutinized in its components with an alchemical eye, colors emphasize the material qualities of the painting. All artworks produced during these years already appealed to the tactile gaze of the audience, revealing the suprasensual qualities of the object. Nevertheless, structure for Oiticica doesn't exist a priori, and there is a great difference here in comparison with Manzoni achromes, but is generated through colors. Malevich is an undeniable source for Oiticica white monochromes called Serie Branca. Carrying on with his research on pigments, Oiticica chose white as the color light, as the synthesis of all colors. Thanks to the restoration of these paintings in the context of the exhibition at Tate Modern in 2007, curators have found out that even apparent monotone series are actually constructed on different layers of colors, but within the same spectrum, and so perceived by the eye as a single one. As a matter of fact, what may be seen as the end of Oiticica's chromatic investigation turns out to be a new starting point. Oiticica appropriates from Malevich not only his formal reductionist technique, but also the meaning, the radical act of rejecting the pastoral acknowledgement of zero forms. As I will explain further, Oiticica translates this act into a Brazilian reality, happily avoiding the risk of repetition and solving the conflict between autonomy and imitation. Malevich's zero's form serves Oiticica as the basis of his desired cultural zero of infinite possibilities of life. The nothingness delivered by the white paintings constitute the impulse of the new beginning. Oiticica articulates the brand new start, not only from a concrete point of view, but also from a socio-political perspective. Merging the aesthetic and the social dimension, the artists try to accomplish the post-colonial desire of creating a Brazilian modern art and identity. And this process of rediscovering Brazilian roots, suggesting a novel aesthetic engagement, culminates in a twofold outcome. Firstly, the formulation of the parangolé, literally capes to wear. In creating this term, Oiticica appropriates from another European master a revolutionary experimental attitude. Indeed, he states, the word parangole here assumes the same character as, for example, Merz and its derivatives, Merzebau, had for Schwitters. For him, they were the definition of a specific experimental position, fundamental to the theoretical and existential comprehension of his entire work. The second outcome is Oiticica's concept of anti-art. In some comments Oiticica made on Decio Pignatari and Marco Zero de Andrade in 1964, the artist summarized his theory of anti-art, a concept that originates from the urge for a permanent critical position. Oiticica is not interested in merely conceptual proposition, as in the phenomenological essence to be found in the practical realization of the work of art. Decio Pignatari, in the text mentioned before, is widely commenting on de Andrade artistic writing as an act made from chance and choice, collage and montage, named anti-literature, and as Decio Pignatari affirms, it comes from nothing, zero indeed. This way of constructing a text is closely tied to establishment of a new language that enables a simple and direct form of communication. Pignatari's comment on de Andrade is important for Oiticica because the same project of renewal is reaffirmed by the artist in the field of art. However, Oiticica's so-called constructive will is not confined to the aesthetical and visual dimension, but is driven by the search for a new way of acting, free from any kind of social repression. Indeed, it's Oiticica's emphasis on the necessity of a novel behavior that constitutes the zero point for reinventing art. And this action is set in continuity with the radical act of painting white on white. Oiticica's appropriation of Malevich leads to a participatory art, and white on white became the model of value to praise. White is the canvas before the painting, zero, full of possibilities of creation and symbol of the dismissal of the past. The rejection of the old world of the past is ascribed not only to the artist, but also to the participator. Participation is made possible through the wearing of colored capes, the parangole. As a matter of fact, the parangole, that is neither a painting nor a sculpture or architecture, turns to be an anti-artistic proposition par excellence, because firstly, it demands the refusal of traditional aesthetic parameters. Secondly, in its revolutionary purpose, it evolved ex nihilo, making the accomplishment of a degree zero art possible. In the following section, I will focus on Piero Manzoni, illustrating the creative process and the theoretical thinking that brought him to the conception of the acrons. At the beginning of his artistic career, Piero Manzoni produced diverse figurative artworks, impronte, Jungian paintings, and catrami. Despite being subjected to an arbitrary division in the critical debate, these artworks possess undeniable similarities. The imprints were actually made impressing various objects, pins, nails, keys, buttons on the canvas. The latter had been previously treated on its surface with a suspension of tar on oil and tar in order to create a background of dark materials. Elio Grazioli understands them under the light of Peirce's indexical signs. More recently, Gregory Tentler understands them under the light, demonstrate that his interpretation to be fallacious. In Manzoni's figuration, not only the actual imprint take on anthropomorphic shapes, but it also seemed to be used by the artist to signify painting with an illusion of depth, creating a third dimension. Moreover, the borders of the object are often repainted by Manzoni, suggesting that he is mainly interested not in the object itself, but in the object as a means. Impronte containing nuce issues that Manzoni will develop later in his most famous works: the interest in materiality, the denial of any sort of individuality, and the challenge to the glorification of the artist's gesture advocated by informal painters. Above all, these paintings show the first signal of Manzoni's later obsession with the theme of the fingerprint, the mark of the artist, that will characterize the eggs and the works of verification. The next series of work are the Jungian paintings, and are based on attentive reading of the work of Carl Gustav Jung, and exhibit an interest in the notion of archetype and mythology. The book Prolegomena to a Scientific Study of Mythology was published in Italy for the first time in 1948. Enrico Castellani mentioned this book as the only one recommended by Manzoni that he could still remember. At the same time, this figuration brought Manzoni in line with contemporary research practices. Germano Celant points out how Manzoni's homunculi have multiple sources of inspiration, being influenced by the nuclear concept of prefiguration or by the personage of Dova, the insects of Fiorelli, and the totemic images of Crippa. Further evidence of the theoretical link that Manzoni establishes between Jung and nuclear art is offered by the artist himself in an interview dated in 1957, where he talks about himself as a psychoanalytical nuclear painter. However, when towards the end of 1957, the nuclearists started looking back towards a sort or more traditional figuration, Manzoni undertook a violent detachment from the movement. He pursued his own path centered around the analysis of the concept of myth, with the aim of bringing together universal individual mythology and universal mythology. If Jungian characters sought to discover archetypes that pertain to a collective unconscious and therefore capable of being identified by all, the acronyms made by the end of 1957 are myths themselves. They don't seek to represent iconic images or to convey symbolic meanings, rather they embody those emblematic values to their own concrete presence. The task is always the same, to ascend from individuality to a universal impersonal dimension. This progression is testified also by the evolution sustained by Manzoni's vocabulary. In a first text, he means to evoke an alphabet of primary images, while in his second published manifesto, he wrote, "And we shouldn't be worried about stylistic coherence, because our only preoccupation must be the continuous research, the continuous self-analysis, through which we can construct more themes recognizable to all in our civilization." In linguistics, a morpheme is the smallest unit expressing significance recognized by a community. In this context, the shift from an alphabet of unrelated graphemes to recognized morphemes connotes the novel objective of the artwork, that is to gain a universal meaning. Acronyms are uncolored raw wall surfaces that strive towards a twofold objective, to set a tabula rasa of what has come before them and to establish a degree zero ground of infinite possibilities of creation. What was only the medium to express a meaning, the canvas, is now work of art, myth and meaning itself. The surfaces of pure white are unrelated to any gesture that belongs to the artist's intimacy, and at the same time responds to Manzoni's urge to experiment with materiality. Indeed, the range of materials adopted by Manzoni from 1957 to 1962 is impressive, from combination of plaster and kaolin of the late 50s to synthetic fibers, wool and fur, that make the surface of the painting extremely tactile. Between 1957 and 1958, the canvas is stitched in squares, mimicking the grid. The grid is the link between zero and infinity. It embodies the archetype of representation, and it permits the serial repetition of a shape module. Manzoni's minimal surface avoids anything unnecessary and excludes multiple interpretations of the work of art. Built on a tautological and self-referential discourse, like living objects growing within a constant interaction with the environment, Manzoni acronyms have their raison d'être in the paradox of making possible the institutionalization of an anti-aestheticism. To summarize, the purpose of this investigation has been the suggestion of new transnational connection between subversive practices. At the same time, I have demonstrated that despite their perceived rupture, there are actually continuities between Manzoni's and Oiticica's own practices. Despite belonging to countries that share different history of misplacement, both artists fully epitomize the actual overtaking of current new avant-garde trends. Also, they have both been considered forerunners of later conceptual artistic expression. In this paper, I've aimed to identify a common artistic ground, the production of a zero syndrome starting from scratch, as the cornerstone that makes this novel link of conjunctions possible. However, this is only one of the perspectives that can be adopted in investigating this kind of artworks and this kind of practices. Taking into account analogies in Manzoni's and Oiticica's subversive attitude, particularly evident in chasing the constructive will of a cultural and aesthetical zero as a new form of beginning, future research will aim to build a theoretical frame detached from the Western perspective in order to analyze these practices from an internal point of view in relation to the national context, And also, at the same time, I want to propose a new web of connections between self-conscious marginal identities, and thus to discover and identify possible or recurring patterns or model of action among new avant-garde practices at the margins. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. And as with everyone else, I would like to thank the organisers of the conference for making it exist and for the opportunity to be here in very good company. And I also want to thank everyone here in the audience, especially as I'm the last person to speak. So thank you for holding on. And I'm hoping to be like Mary Carmen and be very energetic, but I'm not sure I will achieve that. But anyway, between November 1964 and October 1966, from its large premises in central London, the Gallery Signals mounted 11 solo exhibitions and published 10 issues of its eponymous news bulletin. The galleries, since the 1990s, Signals has come to renewed attention according to distinct concerns, amongst which the international reception of Latin American art has proved predominant. 8 of the 11 solo shows featured artists from 2 Latin American countries, Brazil and Venezuela, while its intermittent group shows reflected a wider international network. The gallery's name had first come into circulation as the title of the inaugural August 1964 issue of the News Bulletin, as published by the then-named Centre for Advanced Creative Study. Established in June 1964, the centre's base was a flat in Cornwall Gardens, South Kensington, shared by the future director of Signals, Paul Keeler, and the artist David Medalla. A further 2 artists, Marcelo Salvadori and Gustav Metzger, were also founder members, and Guy Brett, at that time a critic on the Times newspaper, at the age of 22, was its de facto 5th member. Other close collaborators were the artists Takis, Sergio de Camargo, and Jesus Rafael Soto, Paris resident émigrés from Greece, Brazil, and Venezuela, respectively. Its advisors included 2 British art historians, Sir John Rothenstein, who had only very recently retired as director of the Tate Gallery, which he'd directed since 1938, and Roland Penrose, as well as Paris-based proponent of kinetic art, Frank Popper. Amongst its patrons was the American philanthropist Caress Crosby, who was at that time engaged in an effort to construct a peace center for artists and scientists in Cyprus, with the help of Buckminster Fuller and Archbishop Makarios, the then president of the new Cypriot Republic. 3 group exhibitions comprising 1 festival of modern art from Latin America and 2 pilot shows of kinetic art were mounted at Cornwall Gardens before the centre moved, renamed Signals London, into premises owned by Charles Keeler, Paul Keeler's father and a manufacturer of optical machinery. And this is a map of Signals in relationship to other experimental galleries at the time. As you can see, there was quite a sort of close cluster of them in a similar area, either side of Oxford Street. A motivation for discussing the case of Signals in the context of this conference is the relationship between the short brackets of its lifetime and the post-war periodization employed by the Haus der Kunst project, which places the post-war era's ending in the year 1965. However arbitrary that might be, to employ an appropriately kinetic metaphor, if the post-war war's ending can be placed at that point, then that year might be imagined as a fulcrum upon which the 2-year lifespan of Signals seesaws. This metaphor finds its literal tracing in the established narrative of Signals' beginning and its ending. In 1964, it was born in optimism as a forum dedicated to the adventures of the modern spirit, in David Medalla's words, and to passionate belief in the imaginative integration of art with technology, science, architecture, and our entire environment, in the words of its first statement published in the first issue of the News Bulletin. The formal trajectories of certain of the artists whom Signals famously introduced to the London milieu have also been understood to mirror this pattern. Oh, sorry, I've just missed out the ending, sorry. The prevailing, although apocryphal story of its 1966 demise, meanwhile, is that Medala's public condemnation of US foreign policy via the news bulletin provoked its main backer and owner of the premises, Charles Keeler, to withdraw his support. Okay, well now I'm in the right place. The formal trajectories of certain the artists who Signals famously introduced to the London milieu have also been understood to mirror this pattern, particularly those of Neo-Concretists, Oiticica and Ligia Clark, a tipping over from formal concern towards proto-relational forms of social engagement, a tilting from art towards life, from painting and sculpture towards the contemporary post-medium condition. And similarly, the seesaw of Signals' history, perched atop the end of the post-war, is often weighted towards its relevance to present interests. In its choice of artists, Signals has proved both prescient and prodigious. From the kernel of its expansive definition of kinetic art, latter-day discourses such as participation, and forms of practice such as installation spring. From its broad geographical perspective, a prehistory of the Anglophone reception of Latin American art emerges. It has been drawn into critiques of the Eurocentricity of art history and theory that border upon and influenced by post-colonial thought, and more recently its migratory emphasis and role as precursor to the international reception of Latin American art has been examined in relationship to the dynamics of the global transnational, that primary marker of art's contemporaneity. The ability for the case of Signals to be made mutably adaptive to the demands of current art history, exhibition practice, and acquisition policy may be attributed to its expansive definition of kinetic art and the singularly non-prescriptive attitude it maintained towards artists contained within that category. It spread its bets more widely than many commercial galleries of the time, and while it shared interests with neighboring galleries such as the New Vision Center, Latin America was and remains its unique selling point. The multiple versions of its legacy that exist, however, also rest on a degree of uncertainty. Its many histories are written in the absence of anything approximating a substantial archive, but rather through piecing together the individual memories of two of its founder members with the exhibition photography of Clay Perry and the contents of Signals' self-published news bulletin, edited by David Medalla. A combination of present interest and partial recollection will inevitably favour only certain dimensions of its history. Without denying its influence, effect, or contemporary relevance, the aim of this paper is to rebalance the post-war end of Signals' historical seesaw to consider the extent to which it may be characterised as a post-war project. Signals may be related to both a post-war British context and to a post-war New World internationalism, made up of a specific, quite quantifiable set of nations. Looking beyond the large-scale solo exhibitions realised by the gallery, I want to consider how the group exhibition form was used to convey an international and transhistorical post-war worldview, sustained and informed by Signals' developing definition of kinetic art. Signals group exhibitions were not documented in their entirety and remain a less studied aspect of its history. They also exist in different forms and states, those such as Soundings 1 and 2, which took place at the Wigmore Street premises, those such as Art and Movement from 1965, which were formed with some collaboration with the public museums sector. Art and Movement took place in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And those such as Tomorrow Today and Towards the Invisible, which were never realized in any final form, but rather described and developed through news bulletin writings and announcements and rehearsed in the form of pilot shows. As well, it also includes a whole set of unrealized exhibitions that were to take place after 1966. Signals group exhibitions reinforce the centrality of an idea of kinetic art to the gallery's concerns, and its development of the kinetic as a reading of both contemporary practice and its genealogy. insisting on the kinetic as an increasing sum of multiple creative endeavors rather than a defined or foreclosed movement, collective exhibitions combined the aesthetics of mechanized and virtual motion, the use of industrial detritus, natural elements, painted or printed lines, and monochrome surfaces. The never-realized project Towards the Invisible aimed to sort and filter in an accumulating number of individual artists into constellations of interest, including energy, dematerialization and growth, light and color, and the animation and total involvement of space. In fact, the concept of the invisible, much more than the kinetic, became a recurring focus and an expanding proposition, touching on alternative nuances such as immateriality, vibration, energy, anonymity, and nothingness. As the British cultural geographer Simon Rycroft has indicated, the many and various artists drawn under the kinetic rubric were influenced by what he calls the 20th century Enlightenment, characterized by the popularization of post-Newtonian understandings of nature and the cosmos. Old ideas of matter and form were replaced by an Eisensteinian cosmology of energy and flux, and new material relationships were revealed by advances in microscopic and macroscopic visualization. In Britain, this understanding of the material world had been steadily popularized. For example, as Rycroft mentions, the branding of the 51 Festival of Britain was inspired by atomic structures and featured nuclear models that could be entered into and explored by visitors. Although Signals was integrated with an urbane artistic scene, it also found a firm place within the popular imagination in Britain. Its exhibitions were regularly featured on films for television and cinema broadcast, and Madala had reported the presence of numerous students, doctors, nurses, technologists and scientists, alongside representatives of European artist groups such as Zero and Group T at its earliest pilot shows. Beyond UK shores, however, the Second World War and its aftermath had created a newly shared predicament, distributed amongst a set of nations unified not only by alliance and survival, but by a collective knowledge of the possibility of their immediate shared destruction. An important aspect of Signals found in context was this new contemporaneity. I mean that in the sense of being together in time, as Peter Osborne has outlined it in his recent book on contemporary art, which connected Britain not only to a wider Pax Europaea, but also to the newer Western world of the Americas. Signals' deliberate openness and internationalism might in fact be characterized by the defense of an increasingly fragile absence of international conflict. This fueled their optimistic commitment to an imaginative integration of art, science, and technology across geographical borders. And it also fueled its aversions towards ideological or formal entrapment, but also towards competing concepts, such as the autodestructive art developed by Metzger, whose increasingly nominal role as founding member of Signals was gradually downplayed to the point of disappearance. As Pamela M. Lee has argued in Chronophobia, published by MIT in 2004, the international kinetic movement rarely, if ever, acknowledged the negative implications of industrial and scientific knowledge and technological progress, as demonstrated by the historical disaster of the World War. She also notes a tendency for post-war kinetic artists to engage in the construction of a naturalized, linear relationship with their pre-war forebears, apparently unbroken by the advent of war. One of Signals' most comprehensive group exhibitions, Soundings 2, from 1965, demonstrated a twofold concern with tracking the development of contemporary practice and mapping the historical lineage of the post to the pre-war. The presence in the exhibition of work by Albers, Duchamp, Malevich, and Mondrian were not merely an assertion of the continuing relevance of earlier avant-gardes, but also acted as a recognition of how contemporary artists of varying ages included within the show, such as Antonio Calderera, Oiticica, and Alejandro Otero, were targeting these earlier generations as sources for their own aesthetic research. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a humanization of non-weaponized atomic science and the shared predicament of mutually assured destruction was extended into the domain of philosophy by the later writings of the theoretical physicist Werner Heisenberg, whose article, The Role of Modern Physics in the Present Development of Human Thinking, was reprinted in the Signals News Bulletin. Within a post-war world in which an imaginative redemption of nuclear science might be possible, where technology and industry could be rescued from their disastrous role in modern warfare, and where the avant-garde project could be repaired by contemporary practice, Latin America emerged as a region earning its rightful position alongside Western Europe and the USA in the history of modern art and at the forefront of a new future. Signal's founders were drawn to Paris-based Latin American artists, such as Camargo and Soto, through the connection to other European centres of activity, including Zero, Grupo T, and Null, all of whom acted in concert with the Denise René Gallery in Paris as a crucible of both creative and commercial energy. Camargo and Soto, however, came to represent an entree into a field beyond this network, namely modern Latin American art, and brought introductions to the work of less-known artists such as Ligia Clark and Mira Schendel. Beyond the presence and involvement of Latin American artists within a pan-European kineticism, however, the contents of Signal's news bulletin indicate the wider place that this region held within the imaginary at that moment. With some resemblance to a modernizing and affluent post-war Britain, post-war Latin America was seen to be in boom, fully participating in the construction of a future informed by scientific and industrial development and furnished by innovative and sociable architectural constructions. Its second issue placed a decisive emphasis on this region, with an article by Sir Rothenstein on the Caracas University city, by New York gallerist Clara Diamant de Souza on Venezuela's vast abstract theme of artists, another article on Brazilian architecture, and another on the construction of 4 new museums in Mexico City. The Latin America dominating both the British popular imagination and the exhibition spaces of Signals was formed of nations enjoying an economic boom and benefiting from a cultural infrastructure geared up and directed towards internationalism. Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela, to different degrees, had each also followed the USA in siding with the Allied forces, a move that was to decisively affect the economic structure of Brazil in particular and decide the course of its political future. In this, Signal's perspective on Latin America is particularly revealing in terms of understanding the process of historical delay that occurs between the event of a violent political upheaval, notably the April 1964 Brazilian military coup, and an understanding of the consequences. A significant change in the Latin America imagined by Signals became evident only later, long after the gallery's closure in autumn 1966. Madala launched the Exploding Galaxy Collective in 1967. Brett supported the boycott of the 1969 Sao Paulo Biennial, and both Madala and Brett were founders of Artists for Democracy, an organization that placed post-coup Chile at the center of its activities. The newly activist consciousness evident in Madala and Brett's post-1966 activity also acts as a coda to the story of Signal's abrupt ending, reportedly at the hands of a pro-Vietnam conservative enraged by Madala's publication of 2 texts critical of US foreign policy. His support of the US anti-Vietnam campaigners does stand out in stark contrast to other content published within the news bulletin of which he was editor. The combined effect of this intervention and Guy Brett's recorded suspicion of the dominance of certain forms of American painting and sculpture in London has been, the consequence of this has been to entirely eliminate Signal's collaborative connections to United States-based artists. Whereas Signal's tightest and most proximate network centered on Europe, alongside Latin America, the third point on its international radar was the USA, with artist-organizer Willoughby Sharp acting as an early connection. Signal's interest and engagement with North as well as South America rarely enters the narrative of its development. To exhibit kinetic artists working within North America was, however, consistent amongst its unrealized plans. The very first issue of the news bulletin announces an unrealized third pilot show of kinetic art, whose theme was to be a transatlantic exhibition of kinetic art, London, Paris, New York, with Sharp acting as co-organizer. And the final January-March 1966 issue of the bulletin announces announces the intention to organise Soundings 4 and Soundings 5, which would focus on contemporary North American and Canadian art respectively, as well as reporting a trip to New York by Paul Keeler and Alejandro Otero, which also reveals a friendship between Otero and Ellsworth Kelly, more commonly associated with abstract expressionism. Another consistent ambition was an international survey connecting these three territories through the lens of the kinetic and articulating such a connection in art historical terms. The title Tomorrow Today was superseded by that, as mentioned before, Towards the Invisible, a project which hoped to recruit both French post-impressionism and US abstract expressionism to the task of demonstrating that, quote, the apparent divergencies of modern art are in reality, i.e. on the level of the imagination, united by one great theme, the search for dynamic structures underlying the visible world. The only one realised exhibition of this scope which Keeler and Brett were involved in was the 1965 exhibition Art and Movement. Their plan was to include works by Seurat and Cézanne as the earliest historical references, with Latin Americans including Camargo, Clark and Soto entering as part of the widened post-war world alongside representatives of the new American painting that Rothenstein had introduced as director of Tate. As with many of their more audacious plans, however, the final exhibition included neither post-impressionism nor abstract expressionism, although it was the only one of Signal's group connections to reflect the existence of kinetic art in the USA. And notable also as the first UK National Museum show to show the work of Ligia Clark, Soto and Cruz Diaz. Perfect conclusion. The short brackets of Signal's lifetime contain a moment in which it seemed that the production of Western Europe, the USA and Latin America could be imaginatively connected, and unproblematically so. The expanding territory of the kinetic formed a corollary to the scientific and industrial advancements that also filled the columns of the news bulletin. The violent implications of foreign policies stemming from the Cold War were not fully felt at Signals. Political upheavals within Latin America were not immediately intuited. Its imagining of the world in which different regions of the West, old and new, north and south, might play equanimous roles, supported by imaginative connection between new art and new science, was not yet explicitly concerned with realpolitik. It was shaped not by a post-colonial consciousness provoked by the decolonizing British Empire, but rather by maintaining an untroubled sense of connection and possibility, strenuously, to its necessary breaking point. As a sort of freestyle conclusion, I think what I'm interested in arguing particularly through this is to look at the fact that placing Signals within its post-war end rather than taking into account the apparent circumstances of its ending could be particularly valuable in trying to reconsider the perhaps inherited historical narrative of a constant competition between Paris and New York, and particularly the anti-Americanism of Signals, whereas as Terry Smith mentioned earlier, it's important to understand that that abstract expressionist artists can also be removed from the construction of that art as a means of promoting the US cultural politics, and perhaps Signals and the wider European concern with kinetic art could also be activated to retrieve some of the existence of kinetic art within the USA, where it's quite marginalized art historically, at least as far as I know, and particularly the repositionings that occurred through kinetic exhibitions, especially those organized by Willoughby Sharp, where things that we would conventionally receive as being minimalist or part of the abstract expressionism are placed together under a similarly expansive understanding of kinetic art. So, thank you.
Hi, thank you for the interesting papers, and then this is a comment and maybe a question to Lara. Thank you for doing a very good comparison. It's very difficult to do a good comparison, I know. So the I was especially struck by the fact that you started with a concept of a zero zone, and then looking at the two artists in different trajectories. And then I think that was very cogent. In comparison to mine is rather antagonistic, center-periphery comparison I did. You said you want to find the new connections among peripheries, right? Yeah. So my question to you is, that was wonderful. So I want to know, if you don't mind, what else you have in your whatever store, whatever comparisons you have. Maybe if you can give us some hint.
Could you repeat the actual question, please?
Yeah.
So
what are the comparisons you have in your mind right now?
Well, actually, this is like the first stage of my PhD. What I want to do is like compare the two artists, but not just make a restricted comparison or visual comparison between the two, because it doesn't make any sense. I mean, they are so different. What I want to see, if there are, like, studying the case of these two artists and then opening even to the national context, if there are recurring patterns or exchanges between, like, Brazil and Italy. And so, two countries that I consider somehow, well, Brazil for sure, but Italy can be argued, like, out from the Paris-New York axis somehow. It's enough for you?
Maybe, no, it's okay. Maybe some other people can ask questions and I will think about it.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually had a similar thought for you, Lara. And I wonder if maybe that connection might be vis-a-vis Lucio Fontana, who hasn't, I mean, who's kind of a specter, I think, with Midori and your paper, because he's sort of, right, moving around all of these centers, or centers, peripheries, areas, and not really belonging to any one group, but Group Zero mentions him several times. He's going between Italy and Brazil at this very moment, friends with Manzoni. I'm not sure about Otisika, but I wonder if that might, if you could, I don't know, sort of freestyle with that idea.
Yeah, well, Fontana, for sure. I mean, he was Argentinian, and for sure there are more connections that can be driven, taking Fontana as a case of study. But what I find particular is the case of Manzoni or Otisika being actually a key point in international context. And that's what is really inspired me, and I see as like a possible connection. I mean, Fontana, yeah, sure, was a turning point in the Italian reality, but it's actually Manzoni that opens the Italian artistic reality to like later experimentation, arte povera, conceptual art. So that's why, and on the other side, also Otisika opened the Brazilian reality to other sort of experimentation. So that's why I'm so like thrilled by the idea of trying to compare these two artists.
Yeah, I was struck by Midori Yamamura's hint to Uka and the psychologic aspect of it, because you know you always see Uka, but somehow you first never think of it. But it's really funny because you look at it very formally, like the artist wanted at the time. But I'm wondering about also the term of trauma, because with Uka, often it's referred to nail fetishes in African art, but I know in the First World War there were these huge figures that were called, I think, Nagelmänner, I don't know exact word, but they were wooden figures, and people would give money for the First World War and put a nail in it. So they were public in the city, and you had these huge figures full of nails also, and it was directly linked to the war. So I'm wondering whether you find also in the Japanese artists like this war trauma somehow figuring in Kusama's art.
I think there were war traumas all over. It's not only limited to Japan, and I wanted to show that, like, in relation to also Kusama and then like Yucca. The paper turned to be very brief because I had to cover like 3 different areas in like 20 minutes. So I would love to expand it, but and then United States also, I think there were some people who are very seriously considered about European situation and the war. So definitely, and in terms of this, like, you know, the a striking nail that you described, there's Yoko Ono's the piece which is called Painting to Hammer a Nail. And that piece originally, when she exhibited at the Indica Gallery in 1966, people were supposed to be making wishes with their hair, and then you would make a wish knot, and then nail onto the vase. So I guess there's some things that needed to go beyond. And in terms of Kusama's own, I know that Louise Neri is here today, so you must know more, but she does have a condition which is called obsessive neurosis, and she sort of like discovered psychotropic drugs through the treatment process. So that's how she encountered LSD-25 initially, because in the mid-60s, psychiatrists were using LSD-25 to treat obsessive neurosis.
Thank you very much for such an interesting panel. To Nicholas Cullinan. In the Catholic Church, we have so many saint patrons. So, for example, Saint Michael, patron of the Air Force, or Saint Christopher, patron of the postman, and so on. In your opinion, which is the saint patron of arte povera? It's a really serious question. In order to reading better, in my opinion, the link between arte povera and the post-war. Thank you very much.
Well, I suppose what I was doing in the paper was making a link between this idea of Franciscanism, which comes from Buri and the sackcloths, and then goes into a sort of Franciscan aesthetic with arte povera. And there are numerous mentions in the literature of the idea of Franciscanism, a kind of medieval aesthetic. So, I mean, I would say St. Francis, you know, who also happens to be Italy's patron saint with St. Catherine. Why? What's your opinion?
Of course. Of course, I'm completely agree with you. Surely St. Francis is looking art poverist from the highest sky. Yeah. But no, it's interesting to it's just a provocative question to reflect, to ask you to reflect, to get deeper about politics and arte povera, especially with in a post-war perspective. So, however, I think so. It's a St. Francis.
Phew, right answer.
So thank you everybody on the panel. All the papers to me have suggested a kind of strange economy underlying the whole post-war that we're looking at that I really haven't understood before. And I'd just like your opinion on this dichotomy between a desire to transition towards a pure state, a state of purity, obviously echoing the experience of the war, this massive destruction that we heard about in detail this morning, this massively mechanized destruction of bodies and peoples and states and organizations and everything. And in a certain way, a lot of the work that tends in the direction of new tendency and scientific and the semiotic and so on is obviously seeking a kind of resolution of that massive world trauma, or most of the world trauma, on the level of a kind of ordered plane of exit to some purity beyond it, as in the case of Group Zero that you quoted. Otto Pina wants to shoot off into space, into this pure nothingness. So it's one kind of transcendence. But the other one seems to me to be the one that has to be enacted through a repetition of extraordinary violence, and violence on the body. And the Hutai works that on one level, and at certain points, are also pure and playful. They're also amazingly directly violent. And then if we go to the wonderful mural in the church in the Philippines, which actually turned Christ into this terrifying figure. And a number of the key works that we've looked at have taken up the sort of the other theme that we've been speaking about, the theme of trying to create an official sense of order or an official narrative. But in many of the cases, the artists, they accept that to a degree, but in many other cases, they're actually showing you the dark side of that narrative and the possibility of the repetition of all this incredible violence coming back again. And this is true of American artists and artists all the way around the world. So I'm trying to understand something beyond the normal thing about post-war trauma and understand the sort of logic of process. What kind of work can we do to take us through the state we're in to a further state that is either pure and could go on forever, or obliterate us, just obliterate us again. Does that make any sense to any of you?
It sounded like, sorry, it's okay. Sounded like what Alexander Monroe had spoke in this morning about Godzilla schizophrenia. So maybe we should think in such terms about you.
I'm still mulling it over. Do you want to have a go?
What was the point of I mean, as far as it is concerned to my paper, I agree with the fact that actually they want to overcome this post-war trauma and to arrive of this pure beginning, like the zero state. But I think this is particularly true for Manzoni, and well, Oiticica is a different case because, I mean, there haven't been the war in Latin America, so it's a new beginning, but it has other roots, not to reconstruct after the war. And Manzoni has already overcome this post-war drama because he's already living in the 60s, where there was the boom of the car. He was one of the first artists to have the car, and he was able to travel in Europe with his Fiat, so there was like something that nobody else was doing at the time. So he was already exploiting this new reach, Italy, and this new, the advent of the new media, this new economic boom. So I think that the constructive will of Manzoni also goes alongside this like new state of beginning in Italy.
And then, shall I have a go at trying to answer the question as I understand it? Which is, I suppose, what some of our papers addressed and what you're speaking to as well, is this moment of, in the post-war period, flip-flopping between polar opposites, so past and present, pre and post. Even geographically, there's schisms as territories change. You know, in Italy, I was talking about the north-south divide, even within Italy, and then other geographical struggles. So I guess what all of us were addressing is this tension between this kind of seesawing and trying to find an equilibrium, which takes some time and probably doesn't happen, I would say, you know, for things that I'm looking at more into the 1980s and 1990s, there's a very long period of uncertainty. Does that sort of answer the question? Or I'm getting increasingly tired and unwell, so I'm trying to, but...
What it all might suggest also, I think, is one of the things I was trying to point out in terms of this new beginning and this kind of zero. At that point, countries, particularly Brazil, I suppose, which was actually, I think, the only Latin American country that was officially joined the Allies and was used as a military base, and et cetera, et cetera. But what that country represented, not only for the people who ran signals, but also for many others who got involved in constructing museums there, was exactly a monochrome territory. It hadn't been affected by the war positively; it'd been affected negatively. And I think you have to think about that region and how a lot of this idea of what they wanted, what this utopia was, what could be reconstructed, was it had geographical territories that represented that for those in Europe.
I just had one more quick thought. I mean, maybe also what some of the artists we were looking at were searching for is this kind of prelapsarian state. So, for example, in Italy, you go back before fascism, you reboot, and you look at earlier examples of Italian culture to negate the trauma of fascism. I don't know, so maybe that's another strand that goes through.
So question for Isobel, which is, thanks for your paper on signals. It's a very, very exciting and important, initiative and so on, but it shuts down, right, as you mentioned. So my question is, what happens to basically, to the question of kind of, let's say, international exchanges or transnational exchanges after that moment, well into the 70s in England? If you can just say a few words about that.
Thank you. Amongst kind of artists of a international experimental, I would say that I don't think they cease. I mean, maybe something like Signals gave it a kind of visible platform for this, but then also other galleries that continued in London beyond Signals closure would carry on that kind of theme, and also some galleries that were in cities other than London but had a similarly experimental attitude actually pick up on quite a lot of Latin American artists who, there was already a connection between Signals, for example, and a gallery that used to exist in Nottingham called the Midland Group. And when Signals closed, a lot of these artists actually showed up there, especially younger generation of experimental Venezuelan artists, which is interesting. And I think that amongst the kind of art centre movement in the UK, the post-war art centre movement, quite this interest in quite ephemeral forms, such as mail art and sort of later conceptual art, that was very internationally connected. There were spaces for it, but not so much, I don't think, within the mainstream London museums. I've always been quite intrigued by the fact that works were bought by Tate from Signals, and whether that was a policy or whether they were just bought as European art, and because I think they were bought and went straight into the store until around the year 2000. So I guess less so within kind of mainstream spaces, but Signals was definitely not on its own. It wasn't the only centre of this kind of work, and so certainly in the 1970s this would continue with different artists in different places.
Hi, it's Alexandra. Terry, your question, I think, is a very important one, and Nicholas, I think your discussion of Franciscanism in the context of Arte Povera, there's sort of a connection there. And I'd like to just introduce the idea, which I explored quite a lot in the Third Mind exhibition, of how many of these artists, certainly the canonical ones of this period, including Yves Klein, associated with Zero, as well as Aaron Formal, Günter Jucke of Zero, was of course, very engaged with different forms of Eastern philosophies. And some of them, of course, another canonical figure like John Cage, or a more medium-like figure like Namjoon Paik or Yoko Ono, really were very much at the forefront of using Eastern philosophy and Eastern ideas of transcendence, including violence, because in order to transcend, you have to kill the Buddha. You have to be violent. It's a violent act. And at the extreme, it's death. It's the void is death. Void is the nothingness. So there's violence inherent in that pure. It's also an Eastern idea of the void as being full and empty. And I just feel we want to introduce that as we're discussing transnationalism, we're discussing all this exchange of ideas and these different localities. We also have to remember that there was a very profound appropriation, use and misuse of these Eastern philosophies as a form of resistance to Western hegemony, as a form of resistance to Western rationalism and utopianism, both interpreted and misinterpreted forms of a philosophy of resistance that is other, that is lapsarian, that is pre-modern.
That's a good point. Is it a question, or do you want me to sort of... It's a comment. It's a really good one. I mean... I think as it relates to my paper, in terms of, did you want me to tease out an interest in other cultures looking further afield rather than just within Italy? I think that it's surprisingly little, actually, in some ways. I mean, Boetti is probably the main example, who has a big interest in Sufi culture, who obviously starts to spend large amounts of his time in Afghanistan every year after about 1970. So he's the most engaged, which is why I ended with him, and I had to just telegraph it in a 20-minute paper, but he, I think, is looking genuinely further afield and trying to engage in a real way with other cultures. And of course, he actually didn't just spend time in Afghanistan, he lived there, he bought a hotel, he worked with people. It wasn't just an example of misappropriating another culture for your own aesthetic. I think he really genuinely engaged with that culture. In terms of the other Arte Povera artists, I mean, and I hope it came through in the paper that I'm very, very conflicted by all of these references, these very easy references to Vietnam and to, you know, Latin America. It just seems rather superficial sometimes. In terms of other Eastern references, in the artists, there's not so much, actually. They're either focusing more on Italy's past and trying to define their own national culture and specificity, so looking back to a kind of medieval aesthetic, or even quotations of classical statues, which you get in Cunellis and Pistoletto, etc. Or in the more sort of politicized realm, there is this very enthusiastic embrace of the idea of, you know, guerrilla warfare, which is very current at the time. So there's not that, I'll keep thinking about it, but I mean, even Cunellis is very widely read and makes lots of references. Doesn't make so much reference to the East, I think, but I'll keep thinking about it. Thank you.
I would kind of ask a question back at you, which was, how do you think that might relate to this idea of the way in which the Japanese were imagined as being kind of very passive and Zen, and how does that relate to the kind of Euro-US idea of Western interest in kind of the East and Buddhism? Sorry, I started a conversation with the audience.
I think I've spoken enough today, but yes.
Thank you. That sounds good. I think we have one last question.
My question continues the thread by Terry about economies of violence and also how artists reacted in this post-war situation, and it goes more specifically to Midori. Maybe this group of artists that you described, their quest for autonomy was more a subjective one, whereas I think in the sort of groups like Graf and the New Tendencies, it was more like a collective autonomy. Maybe that's a reason, or could it be that this is a reason for the split? That the one side that's more into Eastern philosophy, Buddhism, Zen, subjectively freeing oneself through art, maybe also somehow collectively, and another idea of freedom that's more collective from the start?
something which I couldn't cover with this paper today. There was a new idea of collectivism during this time, where one of the reasons why Zero is having a very late recognition in the United States is because of its fugitiveness. You know, it's a very flux group that Pine says, like, you know, there should be no president, no secretary, no, like, pre-established roles for these people. So, and then Klein says, when, like, you know, they were going to collaborate together, they should get even into quarrels and fights to achieve something together, that it shouldn't be a conformist model of collaboration. That's what like some of the literatures I read by Zero artists says, and this was the reason why they couldn't stay with Grab, so they left because they thought Grab was too organized. Is this a good answer to your? Not really. Oh, okay. Okay, sorry.
But at this stage, I would like to thank you, all four of you, very, very much. It was wonderful and it's a great discussion. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you as well.